What's the NSFW detail about a historical figure that's normally left out of the history books? A bit late to the party, but during WW1, prostitutes in Britain were more expensive if they had STDs. This was because if a soldier hired them and got infected, the soldier could be honorably discharged, and not have to fight in war. Ancient Egyptians believed the god Atum created the universe by masturbating to ejaculation, and that the ebb and flow of the Nile corresponded to how much he came. To honor this, the pharaohs ceremonially masturbated into the river. Horus and Set also tried to impregnate each other with their semen in a couple of myths. Probably said here elsewhere, but Victor Hugo, author of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, among other tales, was a notorious philanderer who had affairs on top of affairs with prostitutes throughout his life. When he died, all of the brothels in Paris had to close because so many prostitutes attended his funeral. Heard he also would write naked, and ask someone to keep his clothes outside the door so he'd continue writing. And this kinky granddad was visiting brothels way into his old age. Heard that he had a mark in his diary for each sort of visit. Piotr Tchaikovsky was a submissive bottom. In one note, never before published in Russian or English, Tchaikovsky wrote of a young servant with whom I am more in love than ever, adding, "My God, what an angelic creature and how I long to be his slave, his plaything, his property." Patrick Henry, the American founding father better known for his quote, "Give me liberty or give me death," kept his wife imprisoned in a cellar because of her frequent outbursts due to postpartum depression. His wife had eventually died in that cellar, and he had buried her in an unmarked grave. 10/10 quote, but the wife-killing part always seems to get left out of history texts. French President Félix Fourier died while getting his dick sucked. Skeptical. The whole press joked about his fate, with numerous word games. The lady he was with was nicknamed the Pompe Funèbre, which is the name for funeral services in French and also literally means funeral pump. There was also, as one of the comments described, the phrase he wished to be Caesar, but was only Pompey. Pompey is Pompey in French and its pronunciation is identical to pomp, which means pumped. Big dicks were considered barbaric in ancient history. The Greeks especially thought that it showed men with big rock-hard full-blooded cocks were full of lust and low intelligence. This is why most of their statues today have them displaying a small dick. I was born in the wrong age. The first thing the father of microbiology, Anton van Leeuwenhoek, put under a microscope was semen. They understood that semen was integral to the creation of life but didn't yet understand the concept of single-cell organisms. He fully expected to see tiny little humans in his jizz. So yeah, the first thing he did was whack off on a slide and look at it. As I recall, he didn't do the deed himself. Mrs. van Leeuwenhoek is credited as lab assistant. Holy fuck, this is now my top comment of ever. Weirdos. Princess Diana and her gadget, a sex toy that she carried around with her when she went on diplomatic trips. She had even shown a table of foreign officials her toy as a prank on numerous occasions. She also believed it brought her good luck. One time she forgot to bring it with her and actually asked a bodyguard to go back to the hotel to fetch it for her. Edit, okay, just checked, and she apparently left it all the way back in the UK while on a trip to Nepal, not just at a hotel, and ordered it to be dispatched to the capital Kathmandu. There are bunches of photos in the press of Diana smiling holding a mine with headlines talking about her bravery etc. Not shown in most pictures was the guy guiding Diana in the minefield, an ex-British Army guy who was working for a charity, NGO dealing with mines. A former housemate of mine worked with him some years later and passed on this anecdote about why Diana was laughing, smiling at this moment. As the guy handed her the deactivated mine, told her its name, origin, what it would do to someone when activated, he then said, "I bet you'd love shove one of these up Camilla's asshole." We noticed that jokes about Fergie always got a laugh. but anything that seemed disrespectful of Dee was met by a sharp intake of breath. That changed between 1996 and 1997. We forget now that the public was beginning to lose patience with her playgirl life. Our letter in The Guardian that summer said, "I read that Princess Diana is to have a holiday. How can they tell?" This was the time she brushed up her image with the landmines campaign. But when Alan Correns said on the show, "I don't know anything about landmines or Princess Di, but I do know you'd be mad to poke either of them," there was a moment's stunned silence, followed by a huge howl of delighted laughter. That was recorded on the Thursday night. The show went out on Saturday lunchtime, and the joke, slightly to my surprise, stayed in. That night there was the fatal crash. The producer came specially into Broadcasting House to lock the master tape in a safe so that it could never, ever be broadcast again. After Alois Alzheimer gave the first ever speech describing the symptoms of what would later become known as Alzheimer's disease, no one in the audience asked him any questions or made any follow-up comments, despite the fact that this was quite literally one of the most important presentations ever given in the field of medicine. For real, Alzheimer's disease affects about 6% of people aged 65 and older. It's a big deal. So why did no one pay it much attention? Turns out they were all much more focused on the next guy on the docket, who, allegedly, was there to talk about compulsive masturbation. Literally, this post is humans in a nutshell. I'm sorry, but my source is in French. I can translate the beginning. King Louis XIV anal fistula. The anal fistula of King Louis XIV is one of the many illnesses that King Louis XIV had suffered. It was his surgeon Charles François Félix which carried the surgery successfully in 1686 after the development of a particular tool and a training on a dozen of indigents. The recovery of the king had a considerable impact in France and in Europe, and gave place to numerous civil and religious ceremonies in the kingdom. Little late but worth a shot. Elizabeth Bishop and Robert Lowell, the poet, had a 30-year letter exchange where Robert, while married, swooned over Elizabeth after he initially met her, declaring his love and want to propose for her all while being married, and her blatant denial and uncomfortable lesbian anguish at this fact. He threatens suicide and lots of self-harm while she's just like, haha, let's read this book together and not think about romance. He was a manic cocaine freak and she was a crazy alcoholic lesbian with a toucan. She drank rubbing alcohol when denied conventional drinks. There's a great play highlighting these events called Dear Elizabeth. He was a manic cocaine freak and she was a crazy alcoholic lesbian with a toucan is my new favorite sentence. The great magician Houdini once escaped a prison cell while fully nude as to not hide anything to escape. However, what the guards failed to check was that he hid a skeleton key in his ass checks. I remember doing a school report on him. Another was being locked nude in a Russian horse-drawn trailer, which was all metal with tiny barred windows. He convinced them to let him have a last kiss goodbye, and was passed lockpicks into his mouth which he used to escape. He'd also taught himself to regurgitate lockpicks by lowering a small potato down his throat on a string and bring it back up. There are dicks everywhere in Pompeii. Dicks everywhere, on walls, streets, posts, carved into wood and stone, arranged in tile mosaics. They're all over the fucking place. You can't swing a cat without whacking a schlong. They're used as arrows to point to brothels, scrawled on walls in graffiti about how good the women are in the city. When you went to the baths, you'd put your clothes in little cubby holes, and you'd remember which column of cubbies you left them in by their mosaic of a particular sex act above said column. America owes its victory in the revolution partly to a flamingly gay Prussian nobleman with a penchant for polyamory. Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben had served in the Prussian army under Frederick the Great, but was forced out due to his complete lack of discretion about his homosexuality. In Paris he met up with Ben Franklin, who offered to introduce him to Washington. At the time, the American forces were getting their asses handed to them by the British and they needed, more than anything, someone with experience in training armies to transform them from a ragged militia into a proper fighting force. They weren't in a position to be picky. Von Steuben, who was blackballed from military service in Europe and increasingly unwelcome in France, took the job. He arrived at Valley Forge in uniform, accompanied by his dog and his 3 French lovers, who also served as his aide-de-camp and translators, and set about training the American army. Because he didn't speak English, his boyfriend, translator Louis de Pottier, would write von Steuben's instructions in French for him and hand them off to Alexander Hamilton to be translated into English for the men, using a technique where he would personally instruct 10 men and then have each of them go and teach 10 more. Von Steuben more or less single-handedly retrained the entire American army in the latest and greatest of European military techniques. His training manual was in use until the Civil War and still forms the basis of the U.S. military training manual used today. After the Revolution, Congress granted von Steuben U.S. citizenship and a massive estate in New York, where he lived the rest of his life in seclusion with 2 handsome American soldiers who were half his age.